One to admit, I was pretty hyped on Auburn going into this season, and rightfully so. They brought in a lot of great receivers. You have Eric Singleton, you have Cam Coleman, you have Horatio Fields, who's coming off a foot injury, and with all those weapons, and you bring in Jackson Arnold too. I mean, there's a lot to be excited about. But as we've kind of seen this year, they've really kind of struggled to pass the football. And I think when you kind of look back and you look at some of the comments that Hugh Freeze said it towards the beginning of the season, I think there's a little bit of a part of you that kind of sits there and says to yourself that Hugh Freeze doesn't entirely trust Jackson Arnold to throw the football. But also, it's pretty evident too that the offensive line definitely has had some. I mean, when you look when you look at this Auburn team, you say to yourself, they've committed 44 penalties for 345 yards. Half of them are as a result of pre-snap penalties. You look and they had 12 false starts and 6 holding penalties in 3 road games this year. Jackson Arnold has been sacked 21 times this season and 14 in the past 2 weeks. So when you're looking at kind of all those results, and then you kind of look at the beginning of the year where they had a really strong win versus Baylor, then they had a couple tune-up games against Ball State and South Alabama. And then, Oklahoma, for the most part, they did hang in there. I don't want to get too much into the illegal play that Oklahoma ran, which that certainly shouldn't have counted. But I mean, Auburn's in a really tricky spot right now because they hung on in the Oklahoma and Texas A&M games, and I've said it before. I think DJ Durkin is one of the best defensive coordinators in the entire country. But when you look at Auburn right now, I mean, fortunately they do host Georgia. They're going to be home. But I guess for me, the big question is, how does Auburn really kind of come together? Because when you look at this team holistically, they haven't had a winning season since 2020. They haven't won a bowl game since 2018. Hugh Freeze is on his 3rd year, and he signed a 6-year, $39 million contract go after the 2022 season. And when you're 14-16 in 3 years, I mean, that's you just can't be surprised that he's kind of on the hot seat right now. And when you're 0-2 in conference play, it's such a monumental game. And I kind of sit there and say to myself, if I was Hugh Freeze, for example, how do you think, what's the best way for them to really kind of really put this team together? I'd say first and foremost, I think Jackson Arnold is getting a little bit too much criticism, if you ask me. I mean, you look at his stats right now, roughly 65% completion percentage, 856 yards and 5 touchdowns. And he's also had 5 touchdowns on the ground too, and hasn't turned over the ball, hasn't really turned the ball over much. So, I mean, I do think for the most part, I think too many people do blame Jackson Arnold to some degree for not being the prolific thrower that you see in some of the other SEC quarterbacks like the John Mateers of the world, for example. But at the same time, too, I mean, the offensive line hasn't really done him favors. And, you sit there and think to yourself, too, how do you kind of find that balance? Because, I look back at the Texas A&M game, and I always kind of think to myself, how come they didn't run the ball as much? I mean, when you go back into that week 1 game versus Baylor when they had 300 something rushing yards, then you go into this game versus Texas A&M, and it just kind of seemed like Hugh Freeze is pretty inconsistent in terms of really kind of committing to the run game. Now, granted, Texas A&M is one of the best defenses in the entire country, so it's never going to be easy to run on Texas A&M. But at the same time, when you're in a situation like Auburn's, one of the things I kind of ask myself is, how come they're not just playing to the strengths of Jackson Arnold? I mean, you can tell between the press conferences that Hugh Freeze has said this year, and also just the overall, makeup of the team. Auburn should be a run-first team, and especially when you see, the amount of inconsistencies on the offensive line, that's really the only way you kind of can think of that too, because all things considered, I mean, the Auburn's offensive line is supposed to be one of the biggest strengths of this entire roster. And for it to be kind of the exact opposite from what we've seen is really, quite frankly, kind of shocking. And I'll say on this program, I've defended Hugh Freeze a bunch on this show. And when you look at just kind of the overall layout of this roster, I mean, they have so many playmakers. I mean, they've are pretty consistent in terms of the pass rush. The secondary is more than solid, and the linebackers, for the most part, they don't really give up a lot of missed tackles. But at the same time, too, when you look at this Auburn schedule for the rest of the year, you have to be a little bit nervous. I mean, Georgia is just an all around good, solid team. But at the same time, too, if Auburn can get home and, versus a Georgia offensive line that also has their own sort of injury issues, I think it's going to be a lot more competitive game than people kind of anticipate. So I think that's something to look forward to. But also going later the year, you have a Missouri team that's going to be facing Alabama this week, a game that I'm personally really excited about. And then you face off against Arkansas, Kentucky, Vanderbilt, and Mercer. So at least for me, when I look at this Auburn team, I think there's a real opportunity for them to kind of come away and get on a really good run here. Now, granted, if Auburn wants to make the college football playoff this year, you pretty much have to win out at this point. I mean, you have the Iron Bowl at the end of the year, but I mean, if they can take care of Georgia, I mean, there is a realistic chance that they can win the rest of the games on the schedule. I'm not certainly sitting there saying that they should be favored, because we don't really know how Missouri is going to look versus Alabama, because they haven't really played anybody. And then Vanderbilt is just a tough team to play no matter what. I mean, I think they showed that when they played Alabama last week. You can say what you want about Diego Pavia. You can say what you will about them not necessarily being as much of a talented team. However, Vanderbilt is always going to be a tough matchup, especially when you're going to be traveling to them as well. So the good news is for Auburn, you still have one of the best defenses in the entire country. They definitely showed that versus Oklahoma, and they certainly showed that versus Texas A&M too. For a Texas A&M team, for the most part, that has done a phenomenal job at rushing the football and letting Marcel Reed be able to go through his progressions and not necessarily have to rely on him too much. That's really a great position to be in too. But at the same time too, when you look at this Auburn team, I don't necessarily think they need to panic and put Ashton Daniels or Deuce Knight or anything like that. But at the same time, too, I kind of sit there and ask myself, how come Jeremiah Cobb's not getting more involved? Because I sit there and say to myself, yes, I think Jackson Arnold is a really strong talent. And, there's a lot of great reasons to be excited about him. But at the same time, I do think there is, some capabilities for them to kind of have that 1-2 punch. And like I said before, when you have guys like Eric Singleton, when you have guys like Cam Coleman and Bryce Kane and all these other guys, it just kind of makes you sit there and say to yourself, how come they're not doing more with what they have right now? And I think we're just kind of getting to a point with Auburn where you can only make so many more justifications and excuses for it, because from all the history that we've seen with Auburn, I mean, they are not willing to be patient with their head coaches. I mean, the Brian Hartson experiment obviously didn't work out, and they've just been kind of fluttering for the most part, and they're paying Hugh Freeze a lot of money right now. But at the same time, too, I mean, we know the success, we know the track record, we know the history of Hugh Freeze as a head coach. And to me, I think this Georgia game is just going to be really telling in terms of what their progression is for the rest of the season, and most importantly, how this offensive line and how this offense are going to come together, because you have Jackson Arnold, who is not an amazing passer, but a guy who is a legitimate leader, who can run the football and, can make plays with his feet, and has shown when he has a pretty solid protection, he doesn't really turn over the ball a crazy amount. However, when you have this offensive line with that much volatility, the defense can only be relied upon so much. And I think that's something that they kind of showed in the last couple games, is when the defense is on the field that long, you can only do so much at that point. So with that said, I mean, if Auburn can somehow clean up the offensive line, get the passing game going a little bit more, and get Jeremiah Cobb going a little bit more too, because I mean, I get Jackson Arnold is your guy and the offense revolves around him, but you got to find different ways to win. And I think this game versus Georgia is really going to be a true testament to that. Now, I think for Auburn, this definitely is a must-win game. But if they can come away from this Georgia game, even just losing by a field goal or a touchdown, and they can prove that they can clean up the penalties and clean up the offensive line play, I think there's a lot of reasons to still be optimistic about this Auburn team, even even though they've definitely been pretty disappointing for the past couple weeks now. But fortunately, their schedule looks pretty favorable, and they still have a lot of talent on this roster.